I'm on here apparently. There we go. There we go. I'll just speak louder otherwise. Perfect. You're probably all thinking, what's going on, aren't you? For those of you that come more often, you're thinking, hang on, he doesn't normally get up and talk so often. Either one of two things is happening. Either A, he's going to be talking for a very long time, which most of you are hoping is not the case. Or B, there's a point to all this. And there is a point to all this, particularly as I'm about to be picking up a chapter from the Bible where it talks about order as the church gathers together, order and worship and things like that. There is a point to all this, which will make clear as we go along, because we're talking about spiritual gifts. And I want to give time for the spiritual gifts to move. And so what we're going to be doing at the end of this message today is we're going to be going back into a longer time of worship where we will hopefully see spiritual gifts flow. Oh, now you're excited already, aren't you? I can tell. I can see it. So we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians 14 today. And 1 Corinthians 14 is a chapter of the Bible which I would suggest probably isn't an easy one to understand because it covers some difficult things. It covers two of what are probably the most common ways the Spirit can manifest in a gathered setting, which is tongues and prophecy. And they're two of the most misunderstood gifts of the Spirit, I would also argue. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time digging into what they are, because these gifts can cause controversy, confusion, misunderstanding. And particularly that can happen if they're not used in the correct way. But we want to try and understand how to use them, because where Paul is getting to here in 1 Corinthians 14 is a sense of order within worship. And so already you're thinking, well, there's not much order here today because he stopped us after 2 songs rather than 4 songs. What is this? He's changing everything. Well, the good news is the Bible doesn't tell us how many songs to sing before a preach or anything like that. So it's okay. There is still order, I can tell you that. But what we want to do is to start understanding this a little bit more and start digging into it. Now, I'm not going to be going into today how exactly tongues work fully, how to use them and things like that. This is covered in the booklet that I sent out. If you haven't got that, if you didn't get the email, let me know. I can send it to you. That's absolutely fine, because we could spend a long time looking at the gift of tongues, interpretation and prophecy. I will talk about it, but not in maybe as much content or detail as some of you might like. But that's because the booklet is there to supplement what I am talking about now. What I want to do is go over it fairly briefly, same with prophecy, but also talk about how we use these gifts as we gather, because there is clearly something important here for us all to understand today. And so I'm going to read through the passage bit by bit, and then we're going to work our way through and try and understand exactly what Paul was saying to this church in Corinth. And the good news is, right at the beginning of chapter 14, he says, follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit. He picks up straight away on what we've been looking at in 1 Corinthians 12 and 13. He's been telling us, as we already looked at 1 Corinthians 12, the gifts are still going today. There's nothing in there that says the gifts have stopped. Nothing. Completeness has not come. We're not yet face to face with God. And so therefore, the gifts are still going today. So he's telling us, but he's also telling us, like in chapter 13, the gifts should be used in an act of love. So we need to follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit. But then he adds on this. He says, especially prophecy. Okay, that's interesting. So we want to eagerly desire gifts, but obviously prophecy is something which should be important within the life of the local church. So what is the importance of prophecy? And then he goes into this next text, which I'm going to read out for you. So verse 2 onwards. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the church. I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I'd rather have you prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be edified. So what we're starting to pick up here is that prophecy and tongues are something that we should be looking to see in the local church. It is clear here that if it wasn't something to be seen, Paul wouldn't spend almost a whole chapter looking at these things, but he's saying they are important. He tells you, I would like every one of you to speak in tongues. Every one of you. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, there's a lot of you here. But I'd rather have every one of you prophesy. Once again, every single one of you prophesy. Have you read that and gone, okay, that includes me? Or have you ever read that and thought, well, that doesn't include me because I'm not one of every one? Well, then what are you? You're clearly part of everyone, aren't you? If you're part of a local church, it's part of everyone. We should all be doing it. But I want you to, so tongues is something, and prophecy is something that we should be desiring. We should be looking for. It should be at work within the local church. And why should it be at work within the local church? Well, prophecies are there. Why? It tells us in verse 3. For strengthening, encouraging, and comfort of the local church. That's why it's there. Whoever needs strengthening, encouraging, and comfort? We all do from time to time, don't we? And God can speak through prophetic things. God can speak through these different gifts of the Spirit to bring strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. That is what they're there for. But he goes in to help us to understand how tongues and prophecy, whilst are both required and should both be active in the local church, are both different. Because one of them is us speaking to God. Tongues is speaking to God. Tongues, or these mysteries he talks about, or an utterance of sometimes when you want to worship God. And this is where we've sometimes, I think, not fully grasped who God is. There are not enough words in the English language to describe God. There are not. There are not enough words in any language to describe God because of who he is. There are not. If God is who he says he is, we need to realize he's bigger than any language in the world. And therefore, there must be times where we come and worship him where we just don't know what to say because there's too much. He's too big. He's too great. And this is where Paul is saying, this is where tongues come from. We're uttering mysteries by the Spirit where we just want to just cry out to him. But we don't often have the words. But tongues are something that speak to God. So when you hear a tongue, it should be Godward. So it's an act of worship to God. That's what a tongue is. Whereas a prophecy is something different. He tells us it is God speaking to us. So it's the other way around. So often if you ever heard a tongue brought, and if someone ever brings an interpretation to a tongue, it should be something which is praise and worship to God. If it's more like a prophetic interpretation, I would potentially argue that maybe that's not the interpretation we should be looking for. And when I say interpretation, what we're not looking for here is, and I think this is where people get confused, when they hear a tongue, when they hear a mystery of the Spirit come out of someone's mouth, they use the word interpret and take it to mean the word translation. It is not a direct translation of what that is said. You can't do that. That's not possible. You could do that in any language in the world. Can I put Spanish into English with exactly the same grammar, exactly the same words, and exactly the same order? It doesn't work, does it? For any of you who speak any other languages, you'll know that. Languages don't line up neatly. Often they're interpretations, and we have to work with it. And it's the same here. It's an interpretation. So if someone gets up and brings an interpretation to a tongue, what they're not doing is bringing a direct translation. They're bringing an interpretation, the theme of the tongue, what it could be, what is that expression of worship that is coming through tongues. So my question there for you is, have you ever desired to speak in a tongue? Ooh. Don't need to put your hand up there, by the way. But I just wonder. But at the same point, you can desire it, but not all believers will necessarily have this gift, as it is a list of the gifts. Okay? But you should still desire it. But prophecy is something we should desire even more. He would rather have us prophesy. Because the one who prophesies is greater. And it doesn't mean they're more important. It doesn't mean that if you've got the gift of prophecy over the gift of tongues, you're better than. Because it was only a couple of chapters ago when we were looking at being the body in the church. No one part of the body is more important than any other part of the body. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is here, it's more important because actually it's through the gift of prophecy you can strengthen, encourage, and build people up. That is what he's saying. Whereas the other one, tongues, is particularly something which is more Godward. But then he goes in to explain it a bit more. Why are tongues and prophecy things we should be looking at? Why should we be trying to understand them? Why should we be trying to get into them more and figure out how they work out in the local church? Because at this point, you're probably going, well, that's just a bit weird, speaking in tongues, because if it's a different language, if it's mysteries that no one understands, and if someone's prophesying, isn't that just a bit weird? Maybe we just forget this, ignore 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, apart from the bits we like, the bits we can talk about the body and the bits we can talk about love. But we can't really do that, because Paul wrote a letter, and we need to understand it in its entireties. And so that's what we're going to try and do. So I'm going to read from verse 6 onward, and we're going to try and understand some of how tongues works and what it might sound like. Now, brothers and sisters, if I come to you and speak in tongues, what good will I be to you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or word of instruction? Even in the case of lifeless things that make sounds, such as the pipe or harp, how will anyone know what tune is being played unless there is a distinction in the notes? At this point, I did think about sitting down and trying to play you something on the piano, at which point you'd realize there's no distinction in the notes that I play, just to highlight the fact that sometimes instruments can be useless depending on who's playing them. So, although I have a mean right hand of the entertainer, but that is the full extent of my piano playing. What is the use? Again, if the trumpet does not sound a clear call, who will get ready for battle? Nice visual picture here, isn't it? Can you imagine? I often think of those scenes in films like Lord of the Rings for me, where you hear like the trumpet sound, the call to war. But if that call was a bit chaotic, people would think, are we attacking? Are we retreating? What we doing? We wouldn't know. What's going on? What's happening? And he says, so it is with you when you meet together. And he's talking about in the context of tongues. Unless you speak intelligible words with your tongue, how will anyone know what you are saying? You will just be speaking into the air. Undoubtedly, there are all sorts of languages in the world, yet none of them is without meaning. If then I do not grasp the meaning of what someone is saying, I am a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker is a foreigner to me. So it is with you. Since you are eager for gifts of the Spirit, try to excel in those that build up the church. Now this is where people would read this and go, well, there's no point in tongues then because it's not worth it. It's just not worth having in your church. Excel in those that build up the church. Forget tongues, it's too difficult to understand. We'll never get our heads around it. But he doesn't say that. Paul doesn't say in that case it's too difficult, forget it. He says for this reason, the one who speaks in a tongue should pray that they may interpret what they say. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So what shall we do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, but I will also sing with my understanding. And this is an interesting distinction here, isn't it? So often when we pray, we only will pray what we know. We like to stick to our script. We like to stick to where we're at, what's comfortable. But there seems to be something here of praying in the Spirit, which is just your overflow of what is happening. We need to learn to pray in the Spirit, but also praying with understanding. Like we also need to sing in the same way. Sing in the Spirit, but sing with understanding. Sing with understanding might be following the words that appear on the screen. Singing with your spirit might be just singing praises to God when there are no words on the screen. It's the same with prayer. Can you pray when there are no words to follow on a piece of paper in the same way as you can pray when there are words to follow on a piece of paper? Otherwise, when you're praising God in the Spirit, how can someone else who's now put in the position of an inquirer say amen to your thanksgiving, since they do not know what you are saying? You are giving thanks well enough, but no one else is edified. So we're talking here about tongues and how tongues have a role to play, but without an interpretation, no one understands what's going on. That's like me putting you in another country where they speak another language and saying, go to that church service and let me know how you get on. Tell me what the sermon was about. You'd have no concept whatsoever if you don't speak the language. You wouldn't. So you'd be thinking, well, what's the point in that? I can't understand a thing. But Paul is not saying it's not important. He's just saying it needs to be interpreted. And the one who brings the tongue should be the one who also prays for interpretation, particularly if we don't know someone has the gift of interpretation in the local church. Otherwise, what is the point of the tongue? Because no one else can say amen, because they don't know what we're saying amen to. But once again, we can see that tongues are important to Paul, and he's not saying don't do them, because he says, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. If this was something that was not important, Paul wouldn't spend his time doing it. Paul was pretty busy. He saw many churches established in many nations, and he wrote pretty much half the New Testament. This is a busy guy. And yet he still found time to speak in tongues more than most of us. So maybe we should be looking to spend more times in some of these things than what we spend in other things. And then the next bit, I always laugh at this because this is the bar I set for myself when I try and preach. But in the church, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. So as long as I speak 5 words you understand, I'm pretty good, all right? That's the way I always look at that one. But what he's saying is the reality is if we're going to see the church built up, if we're going to see us grow, if we're going to see us strengthened and comforted, what do we need? We need to understand what God is saying. And tongues have a purpose, but only if they're interpreted. Otherwise, how are they building people up? Whereas prophecy, that is different because that comes in a language we can understand. He carries on, brothers and sisters, stop thinking like children. In regard to evil, be infants, but in your thinking be adults. In the law it is written, with other tongues and through the lips of foreigners I will speak to this people. But even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. Tongues then are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers. Prophecy, however, is not for unbelievers, but for believers. So if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and inquirers or unbelievers come in, will they not say that you are out of your mind? But if an unbeliever or an inquirer comes in while everyone is prophesying, they are convicted of sin and are brought under judgment by all. As the secrets of their hearts are laid bare, so they will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. Now, question. How many of you would love people who don't know Jesus to come into this building on Sunday and leave going, wow, God is really among you? I'd like to think, pretty much everyone sat here, right? I'd like to think. And I can tell from your enthusiasm that's what you think as well. I can just pick up on that vibe, okay? So, what is one way that happens? By prophecy being brought. And people being convicted of their sin, because there's no way. Because what happens when a prophetic word is brought, if God has given someone a prophetic word about someone, sometimes it can be so personal that the person sitting there is going, how does that person know that about me when I've never met them before? You might have had that before in your life. You know, I've come across people before who've had such direct prophetic words that there's to do with family history, even to do with bank account numbers and things, that there's no way that anyone else would know, that it's like, God is clearly speaking. And which you can't go, it's clearly for me, because there's no way that that person up the front would know that. And that is what makes people go, wow, God is really among you. Because it must be from God, because where else is that coming from? Where else is it coming from? So we need to start realizing, and actually as we gather, so if the whole church comes together, look, we're together. It's a few away, but that's okay. We should be looking for things like prophecy and tongues. We should be looking for the gifts of the Spirit to move. Why? So that people go out here and say, wow, God is among you. That's not God among us, that's Rob's phone talking, okay? I'm telling you. It's still going, we don't know what it is at the moment. He's listening to another message, he's got bored with this one. So, right, I'm going to spray you with my water bottle in a minute, Rob. But that's what we should be looking for as we gather. Do you gather just to sing songs you know and to hear passages of the Bible you may have heard before? Or do you gather to meet with God and so that people go, wow, God is really here. Why are you here? You can take that however you want to, by the way. But why have you come this morning? Have you come to meet with God? What is your expectation? Have you come just because you like a few people here? You don't like some of them, but we won't talk about them. But you like a few people here that you want to catch up with and see what they did yesterday? Or have you come because you want to see what God is going to do? There's an expectation to meet with God. And you want to have your life transformed by God. Why are you here? By the way, I hope you're all still here next week. I'm just going to put that out there. You're not scared off by that. I want you to come and meet with God. I want us all to go, wow, God is among us today. That's what I want to see for this church. I don't want you coming because it's, well, you probably more come when it's not me speaking, but whoever's speaking, it shouldn't be the name of whoever's up on the platform or who's leading worship. That should be the least important thing to you. The most important thing should be, I'm coming because I want to meet with God, because when we gather together, He does some amazing things. That's why I want to come and be here. That's why this room should be full every week, because people going, I'll tell you what, I could sit at home, or I want to go and see what God is going to do amongst His church. Imagine what would happen if we came with that expectation and God started speaking and moving in that way. What would happen to this local church? But Paul goes on to talk about order in worship and how that shall work out. He says, what then shall we say, brothers and sisters? And I'm just going to put a disclaimer down that there is a very controversial bit in here which I'm going to touch on, but not go into full detail of, because people would write full messages on this. What then shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, we're together. Each of you has a hymn, a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or interpretation. Okay? We're together, each one of you. Every single one of you, yeah, that's right, has something. You might not realize it. Maybe you're not listening. But each of you has something. Why? Because everything must be done so that the church may be built up. Everything. That's why we're doing it. We do it to build up the church. Why? Because the church is the way that God said He's going to show Himself to the world. Not through me, not through anyone else who gets up on a platform, it's through the church, through all of us, together, the church. This is how people are going to see Him. Okay? That's what it's going to look like. But when you do this, and when you build everyone up, if anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or at most 3 should speak, one at a time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. So when we come together, if lots of people come up and try and bring a tongue, and there's no interpretation, myself as a leader or one of the other leaders would probably need to go, actually, let's just hold fire on there's no interpretation. Because otherwise, like we've already read, it's unintelligible. It means nothing without an interpretation. Not a translation, an interpretation. Therefore, keep that gift quiet until we have an interpretation. But also, 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn. All. All. Oh, there's another good word. We can all prophesy in turn, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. The spirits of prophets are subject to the control of prophets, but God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. So as we come together, we should be coming together with an expectation to have God amongst us, for God to move, for God to do things. We should be coming together expecting to hear things like prophecy, expecting to hear things like tongues, so that we can be instructed, encouraged, built up, strengthened, comforted. Okay? This is how we should do it. And then Paul says this, and this is the bit that has caused some controversy down the years, and often has been a few verses that have been focused on, I would argue, too much, not in the context of the whole passage. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Now, we have to be careful as we read the Bible, because if you read that literally, as some do, you are in a bit of a problem. Because in the very same letter to the church in Corinth, Paul says this in chapter 11, but every woman who prays or prophesies. Now you're in a bit of a pickle. Because if you're going to take that literally, that women should be silent, you've also got to take it literally that women are also allowed to pray and prophesy. So which one is it? What are you going to do? And this is why I think these verses have been taken out of context for a long time, and we've probably had a lot of women who've been hurt by the church. Okay? Because these verses have been read in a way which I don't believe Paul meant them to be read. Because there is no way he would say in the same letter about women praying and prophesying and then saying women should remain silent. Also, you read in Joel, in one of the Old Testament books, you read talk about in the last days that men and women will prophesy. So once again, is God contradicting himself in what he's saying? Or have we read this wrong and maybe hurt some women in the process? I think that's probably more the case, personally. So, firstly, I want to stand up here and say, if you're a woman who's been hurt in a church before, I'm sorry. Because I don't believe that's what these verses should have done to you. I am sorry if you feel that you have been made to be silent in a way which I do not feel is what Paul was getting at here. Let me explain what I think Paul is getting at here. Because let us remember what he is talking about here. The context of the passage is about having order when the church comes together. That is what the context is. And what church is he writing to? He's writing to a church in Corinth where there was chaos in the church. There were people who were also trying to worship false gods in the church. There were people who were trying to use spiritual gifts for their own gain in the church. This is the church that Paul is writing to. So why is he writing this? Well, for one, I think it's probably to do with the fact that as the church came together, there was no order. And probably as the church came together, as is often in churches today, there are more women than men. Don't ask me why. There just are often more women than men in the local church. And I believe what then was happening is people were talking during a time of gathered worship when they should have been trying to listen to God. Because if we're trying to hear the voice of God, if we want to know that God is amongst us, and there's people around us chatting, chances are, if you're anything like me, you are going to be super distracted by all those other voices around you. That's why, for me, sitting down the front is so great. When I sit at the back, I'm a shocker. I will notice everyone who comes in. I will notice what you're doing, whether you're paying attention or not. But sitting down the front means I just see up here. It helps me, because we can get distracted, can't we? And I believe what Paul was saying here is there were a group of women in this church who were talking, who were not there and building up the church at that point. They might have even been asking questions about what was going on, what was happening. It might not have even been that they were asking questions that were wrong, because he says if they want to inquire about something. But I think sometimes we need to realize when we come together, there's a time and a place where we should be looking to God to worship him and hear from him, and there's a time and a place where we should be looking to hear voices of others and asking questions to each other about what does that mean. So if you all started talking now, and none of you were listening as I was speaking, I think that's exactly what he's talking about. You were spending more time talking to each other about what does he mean by this? In this moment, I think that's what he's getting at. So what do I think Paul means here? I think he means that when we come together, the voice we should be listening to or looking out for is the voice of God rather than the voice of each other chatting to each other. That doesn't mean there's no place for each other to chat to each other. But I think when we come to a place of what we call worship, listen for his voice. And so I don't believe that is something just for women. I believe that's for men as well. Let's listen for his voice rather than the voices of those around us. And then he goes on to say, "Oh, did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only people it has reached? If anyone thinks they are a prophet or otherwise gifted by the Spirit, let them acknowledge that what I'm writing to you is the Lord's command. But if anyone ignores this, they will themselves be ignored. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy, And do not forbid speaking in tongues. Ironic how many churches would. But everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. So should we expect to see spiritual gifts? Absolutely. Should we be looking to see prophecy? Well, we should be, because we should all be eagerly looking to prophesy when we get together. Should we be forbidding anything like tongues? No, we shouldn't, even if we don't understand it. But it should be done in a fitting and orderly way. One of the questions I get asked sometimes is, well, are gifts just for when you gather together? No, they're not. However, there is a clear instruction that when we gather together, there should be an expectation for God to use the gifts. I believe the gifts should be used everywhere we go. You can prophesy here, you can prophesy anywhere, but I believe when we gather together, we should be looking for the gifts. Clearly, it was something that was key to what Paul was talking to this church in Corinth about, that when we come together, every one of us has this. And when we say fitting and orderly way, how do I try and work that out here amongst us? Well, I would say if you feel that God is speaking to you and you have a prophecy, a tongue, whatever it may be, a word of knowledge, come down the front and see whoever's hosting the meeting. Today that's Rob. It's the one who opens up the meeting. And tell him, I feel that God might be speaking to me about this. And if he feels it's right to come in the meeting at that point, he will give you the microphone and let you bring that. It's what fitting and orderly is. We don't just want everyone just shouting out from wherever. That's not much order, is it? We're trying to bring order to what is happening here. We're not trying to control you, we're trying to bring order. Because it does tell us in there, doesn't it? That if two or most three should speak at one time, someone must interpret. If there's no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet. Who's going to be the person making sure that happens? Well, that's why you've got, hopefully, leaders to try and help bring order to what we're trying to do and how we are trying to do it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back into a time of worship. So I'm going to ask Tom and the band to come back up. But we are going to look for some gifts to flow and see what God does. And if God doesn't speak, that's okay. But if he does, even better. Because when we get together, we should be eager to prophesy. As I said, what's your expectation? Already, even now, what's your expectation as you're sat there at the end of Adam's talk? That's great, but I'm not expecting God to speak to me. Right now, you need to be praying for your own cynical heart and mind. Okay? Just going to put that out there. What's your expectation? Even as you get ready to come on a Sunday morning, are you praying for God to give you something to bring when you come and gather with the church? Are you? Or are you not? Even during the week, are you praying, God, give me something. Help me to play my part in the local church? Because every single one of us, here we are, get a chance to play a part. So what I'm going to do now, and if you're wondering so you don't forget this stuff, the booklet I sent out, if you go to page 22 in that booklet, it gives you some steps you can do that can help you to get ready for this. Step 1, nice and easy for you. During the week, I asked God to alert me to any prophetic word that he would like me to bring at the Sunday meeting. Could you do that? Yes, you could. It doesn't need to be long. Just as you're praying, God, just if you've got anything prophetic for me to bring this Sunday, let me know. Great. We can all do step 1. Step 2, during the opening song, I whisper to God a request that he show me when and how to bring the word he showed me during the week. Or if I don't yet have a word, to please give me one that will encourage the people and help bring an immediate sense of God's presence to the meeting. Okay? You can all do that. But if you all start not turning up for the first song, you can do it in the second song. Okay? And then step 3, whatever he's brought you, bring it down the front, and we'll see how it fits. But let me pray, and then Tom is going to lead us into a time of worship, and we're going to see what God is going to do. Heavenly Father, I just want to pray this morning that even right now, where there is already cynicism, I pray that you will replace that with faith. God, your word is clear that we shouldn't be forbidding gifts, that we should be eagerly desiring, that you have equipped all, you gift all, every one of us. And that no matter what the gift is, as we read earlier in 1 Corinthians a few weeks ago, that every place and every gift is important because we are part of one body. Father, help us not to be a church that expects to come and hear one voice on a Sunday morning of whoever's preaching. Help us to be a church which is coming to hear your voice through every single one of us as we gather. Help us to be a church which is so eagerly wanting to meet with you on a Sunday morning as we gather together that there is no place we would rather be on a Sunday. Because we know that this is the place that we can go, wow, God is at work. And Father, right now, I pray as we are here, I pray that you will be speaking into everybody's lives here right now. Father, I pray that they will hear your voice, whether that's audibly, whether that's through a song that we sing, a scripture, something visual in the room they see. Father, I pray you'll be speaking to people. I pray you'll be gifting people, giving people a prophetic word to bring to see the strengthening, encouragement, comforting, building up of the local church. Father, even right now as people are sat there going, no, God, that can't be right what you're telling me. Father, I pray you'll give people the courage to step out, knowing that it's not about getting everything right, but it's about taking a step of faith. It's about obedience. It's about going, God, if you're saying that, I'm going to take a step out and say that, even if I feel so uncomfortable and I need to change my shirt afterwards. Father, I pray that we won't worry about what other people think. We'll be more concerned about what you think and about taking a step of faith to you. So, Father, I pray you will speak now as we sing a time of worship. May we hear your voice clearly through various gifts that you have so given us. Jesus, I just pray that your Spirit will move in power amongst this church, not just today. And Father, I pray that this won't be just for today, that this will be a pattern, that every week we see this. We see you move in power, that the expectation of every single one of us goes up a level because we come to meet with you. Jesus, send your Spirit in a mighty way right now. In your name we pray. Amen.
If you want to, let's stand.